I never thought I'd find myself in this position, sitting across from him at the dinner table, his piercing blue eyes locked onto mine. I could feel my heart pounding in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. He's my best friend's dad, for crying out loud. This should have been just another ordinary family dinner at their house. But nothing about the way he looked at me felt ordinary. It started months ago, though I'm not entirely sure when. Maybe it was the way he'd casually ruffle my hair when I stopped by their house, a gesture that felt strangely intimate coming from him. Or perhaps it was the way his gaze would linger just a second too long, as if he were trying to decipher some hidden secret I wasn't even aware of myself. Whatever it was, I couldn't deny that I noticed him noticing me. And once I noticed, I couldn't stop noticing. His name is Alex, but everyone calls him Mr. Carver. At 45, he's the kind of man who makes you do a double take. Broad shoulders, salt and pepper hair, a jawline sharp enough to cut glass. He's the textbook definition of ruggedly handsome. And while most of my friends' dads are content with beer bellies and bad jokes, Mr. Carver exudes a quiet confidence that's hard to ignore. Of course, I tried to ignore it. For weeks, I convinced myself that I was imagining things, that the subtle smiles he gave me, the way he'd lean a little closer when we talked, were just him being friendly. But then there was the night of the bonfire. It was a chilly evening, and Harry, my best friend, had invited a group of us over to hang out in his backyard. We sat around the fire pit, laughing and swapping stories, the smell of burning wood mingling with the crisp autumn air. Mr. Carver joined us briefly, bringing out extra marshmallows and making sure we had enough blankets. When he handed me one, his fingers brushed against mine, and I swear I felt a spark. "You're shivering," he said, his voice low and warm. "Wrap up. Can't have you catching a cold." It was such a simple thing, but the way he said it made my stomach flip. And then as he walked away, he glanced back over his shoulder and caught my eye. That look, it was as if he could see right through me, like he knew exactly what I was feeling, and felt it too. From that moment on, everything changed. I started finding excuses to be at Harry's house more often, hoping for a chance to see him. Sometimes, I'd catch him watching me when he thought no one else was looking. Other times, he'd strike up a conversation, asking about school or my plans for the future. His questions always felt more personal than they should have, like he genuinely cared about my answers. One Saturday afternoon, I'd gone over to help Harry with a school project. We were in his room, surrounded by papers and textbooks, when Mr. Carver knocked on the door. "Harry, your mom needs you to run to the store," he said, leaning against the doorframe. His eyes flicked to me briefly, before returning to his son. "Do you mind?" Harry groaned, but grabbed his keys. "Sure. Be back in a bit." As soon as Harry left, the atmosphere shifted. It was just me and Mr. Carver now, the air between us charged with an unspoken tension. He stepped into the room, his gaze settling on me. "You've been spending a lot of time here lately," he said, his tone light but laced with something deeper. I shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Harry's my best friend. Where else would I be?" He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Right?" For a moment, neither of us said anything. He stood there, looking at me like he was trying to figure me out, and I felt like I was under a microscope. Finally, he broke the silence. "You're a good kid, you know that?" I laughed nervously. "Thanks, I guess." "No, I mean it," he said, taking a step closer. "You're smart, funny, respectful. It's rare these days." My cheeks flushed at the compliment. Thanks. That means a lot." He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. And then, almost imperceptibly, he leaned in. My breath caught, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. But just as quickly as he'd moved, he straightened up, clearing his throat. "I should let you get back to work," he said, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "Don't want Harry thinking I'm distracting you?" With that, he turned and left, leaving me reeling. What the hell had just happened? Was I imagining things, or had there been something in the way he'd looked at me, in the way he'd leaned in? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more dangerous than the last. Over the next few weeks, our interactions became more frequent and more charged. He'd find reasons to talk to me, to be near me. Once, when I was helping Harry move some boxes in the garage, Mr. Carver came out to lend a hand. As we worked side by side, our arms brushed, and I felt a jolt of electricity that left me breathless. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and full of concern. "Yeah," I managed, though my pulse was racing. "Just tired." He nodded, but didn't move away, his presence overwhelming. "Let me know if you need a break." I'd never been more aware of someone in my entire life. Every glance, every touch, every word felt loaded with meaning. And yet, there was always a line we didn't cross, an unspoken understanding that whatever was happening between us had to stay unspoken. But that all changed one night when Harry was out of town for a soccer tournament. I'd stopped by to drop off some notes he'd forgotten, expecting to hand them to Mrs. Carver and leave. Instead, it was Mr. Carver who answered the door. "Daniel," he said, surprised, but not unhappy to see me. "What are you doing here?" "Harry forgot these," I said, holding up the notes. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "You've come all this way. At least let me get you something to drink." I hesitated, but eventually followed him inside. The house was quiet, almost eerily so, and I realized that Mrs. Carver must not be home. As I sat on the couch, he handed me a glass of water and sat down next to me, closer than he needed to be. "Thank you for looking out for Harry," he said, his voice soft. "He's lucky to have a friend like you." "He's my best friend," I said, my throat dry. "I'd do anything for him." He nodded, his eyes searching mine. "You're a good person, Daniel. Better than most people your age." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, my heart hammering in my chest. The tension between us was almost unbearable, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to leap into the unknown. And then he did it. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and the world seemed to stop. I looked at him, my breath catching, and saw the same conflict in his eyes that I felt in my own heart. But then his hand moved to my cheek, his thumb tracing a line along my jaw, and all rational thought disappeared. "Alex," I whispered, barely recognizing my own voice. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Tell me this is wrong." I couldn't. My lips parted to speak, but no words came out. Instead, I leaned into his touch, my heartbeat deafening in my ears. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge what I'd been pushing away for months. I didn't want him to stop. His fingers trembled slightly as he cupped my cheek, as if he was just as unsure about this as I was. "Daniel," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. This is dangerous." "I know," I said, my voice barely steady. "But I don't care." And just like that, the barrier we'd been tiptoeing around for weeks shattered. His lips met mine, tentative at first, as though testing the waters. But when I didn't pull away, when I kissed him back, the hesitation melted away. The kiss deepened, and I felt his hand slide to the back of my neck, pulling me closer. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced before, a heady mix of passion and desperation that left me dizzy. Every thought, every fear, every shred of doubt was drowned out by the feeling of him, of us, in that moment. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathless, his eyes searched mine, filled with a mixture of longing and regret. "This shouldn't have happened," he said, though the way his thumb brushed over my lips told a different story. "But it did," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "And I don't regret it." His brow furrowed, as if he was wrestling with the weight of what we'd just done. "Daniel, you don't understand what this could mean." For you, for me, for Harry. I know it's complicated, I said, cutting him off. But I also know that this isn't just in my head. You feel it too, don't you? For a moment he didn't answer, his jaw tightening as he looked away. But then, with a heavy sigh, he nodded. I do. God help me, I do. The confession hung between us, heavy and undeniable. I reached for his hand, intertwining my fingers with his. Then let's figure it out together. I don't know what this is, but I know it's real. He stared at our joined hands, a flicker of something. Hope, maybe, crossing his face. You're too young to be dealing with this, he said finally. You deserve something simple, someone your own age who doesn't come with all this baggage. I don't care about simple, I said firmly. And I don't care about the baggage. I care about you. His eyes softened, and for the first time, I saw a vulnerability in him that he usually kept hidden behind his confident exterior. You don't make this easy, do you? Should it be? I countered, a small smile tugging at my lips. He let out a low laugh, shaking his head. No, I suppose not. For a while, we just sat there, the silence between us comfortable yet charged. I could see the wheels turning in his head, the conflict written all over his face. But even with all the uncertainty, there was one thing I knew for sure. I didn't want this to end. Over the next few weeks, everything changed, and yet nothing did. To everyone else, we were the same as we'd always been, Harry's dad and his best friend. But behind closed doors, in stolen moments when no one was watching, we were something more. It wasn't easy. Sneaking around, finding excuses to see each other without raising suspicion. It was a delicate balance that left me constantly on edge. But for every moment of doubt, there was a look, a touch, a whispered word that reminded me why it was worth it. One night after Harry had gone to bed, I stayed behind to help with homework. In reality, it was just an excuse to be near Alex. We sat in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows on his face as he pretended to read a book. You're not even turning the pages, I teased, breaking the silence. He looked up, a smirk playing on his lips. Caught me? I set my own book down and leaned back on the couch, my eyes on him. What's on your mind? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. You. Always you? The honesty in his voice took me by surprise, and I felt my cheeks flush. You say that like it's a bad thing. It is, he said, though his eyes told a different story. I can't stop thinking about you, even when I know I should. Then don't stop, I said softly. Maybe we're not supposed to. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. And then, without a word, he closed the distance between us, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that left no room for doubt. But not everything was as perfect as those stolen moments made it seem. The weight of our secret began to take its toll, and I could see it in the way Alex would pull away sometimes, as if trying to convince himself that this couldn't last. And then there was Harry, my best friend, the one person who trusted me without question. The guilt of betraying him ate away at me, even as I told myself that what I had with Alex was worth it. One afternoon, as Harry and I sat in his room playing video games, he turned to me with a frown. You've been acting weird lately, he said. Everything okay? My heart sank, panic rising in my chest. Yeah, I'm fine. Why? He shrugged, his eyes narrowing slightly. I don't know. You just seem distracted. Like you're keeping something from me? I forced a laugh, hoping it sounded convincing. You're imagining things. I've just been busy with school stuff. He didn't look entirely convinced, but he let it go. For now. The breaking point came one evening when Mrs. Carver returned home unexpectedly early. Alex and I had been sitting too close on the couch, the air between us crackling with tension, when the sound of her keys in the door made us spring apart like guilty teenagers. Her eyes flicked between us as she walked in, her smile polite but slightly curious. "Daniel, I didn't know you were still here." "I was just leaving," I said quickly, grabbing my bag and heading for the door. As I left, I glanced back to see Alex watching me, his expression unreadable. I knew then that we couldn't keep this up much longer, not without someone getting hurt. The cracks began to show not long after Mrs. Carver's unexpected arrival. Alex grew distant, his texts became sporadic, and the moments we stole together were laced with tension rather than excitement. I told myself it was just a rough patch, that we could work through it. But deep down I knew the weight of our secret was pulling us apart. It was on a chilly Wednesday evening, a week after that incident, that everything came to a head. Alex had asked me to meet him at the park, our usual spot. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the playground, but there was no warmth in the air between us. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice heavy with regret. I froze, the words hitting me like a punch to the stomach. "What do you mean?" He ran a hand through his hair, avoiding my gaze. It's too much, Daniel. I can't keep sneaking around, lying to everyone, lying to myself." My throat tightened, and I fought to keep my voice steady. "You're not lying to yourself. What we have is real, Alex. You know it is." He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and sorrow. "It is real. That's the problem. I've let it go too far. I've been selfish, putting what I want above everything else, above Harry, above my own family. I can't do that anymore." The words stung, but what hurt more was the way he said them, like he'd already made up his mind. "So that's it? You're just giving up?" "It's not giving up," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "It's doing the right thing. For once." I shook my head, the tears I'd been holding back spilling over. "You're a coward, Alex. You're too scared to fight for this, for us." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch my face one last time. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I never meant to hurt you." I pulled away, the pain too much to bear. "If you're sorry, then don't do this. Don't let me go." But he did. He walked away, leaving me standing there in the fading light, my heart shattered into a million pieces. The days that followed were a blur of anger and heartbreak. I avoided Harry as much as I could. The guilt of what I'd done was too heavy to face him. But avoiding him only made things worse. One evening he cornered me in my room, his arms crossed and his face set in a look of determination. "All right, spill. What's going on with you?" I tried to deflect, to brush him off with some lame excuse, but he wasn't having it. "Don't give me that crap, Daniel," he snapped. "You've been acting weird for weeks. You're my best friend. I know when something's up." The dam broke then, the weight of everything I'd been carrying too much to hold in. "I can't, Harry. I can't." His expression softened, the frustration giving way to concern. "Whatever it is, you can tell me. You know that, right?" I wanted to believe him. I wanted to tell him everything, to finally get it off my chest. But how could I? How could I look him in the eye and admit that I'd fallen for his father? Instead, I just shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "I'm sorry," I choked out. "I'm so sorry." He didn't push me after that, but the distance between us grew. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the confusion, and it killed me. A month later, everything came crashing down. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was at the Carver's house helping Harry with a school project. Alex was out running errands, or so I thought. Mrs. Carver's voice rang out from the kitchen, sharp and angry. "What's this?" Harry and I exchanged confused looks before heading to the kitchen. There, on the counter, was Alex's phone. The screen was lit up with a series of messages from me. The color drained from my face as Mrs. Carver turned to me, her eyes blazing. Care to explain this? Harry grabbed the phone, his eyes scanning the messages before he looked at me. Betrayal written all over his face. Is this some kind of joke? My voice failed me. There was no excuse, no explanation that could make this okay. Mrs. Carver turned to Harry, her voice trembling with fury. Get him out of this house. Now. Harry didn't say a word. He just grabbed my arm and dragged me to the door, shoving me outside. Don't come back, he said, his voice cold and unfamiliar. The door slammed shut behind me. And just like that, I lost everything. Alex, Harry, the family I'd come to think of as my own. In the weeks that followed, I tried to pick up the pieces of my life, but the damage was done. Word spread quickly, and the whispers and judgment followed me wherever I went. Alex tried to reach out once, but I didn't answer. What was there to say? He'd made his choice, and so had I.
Hey there. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, drop a comment, and subscribe to help us grow and keep sharing amazing content with you. And feel free to explore our other videos, we've got so much more epicness waiting for you. Thank you for being part of our journey, you're the real MVPs.